Losing a parent changes everything a child knows about the world. 10-year-old Mariah moved in with her grandfather, carrying grief too heavy for small shoulders. Her only comfort was Dusty, a loyal rescue dog who never left her side. But something began happening in their backyard. Day after day, Dusty became obsessed with digging one spot. One evening, Mariah followed her dog and watched him uncover a rusted metal box in soil. Inside were hundreds of letters written by a woman decades ago. But the shocking discovery wasn't old letters. It was recent ones mixed with them. Letters revealing a family secret that changed everything Mariah knew. What happens when a girl discovers the family she lost isn't gone? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the gauze curtains of the old house on Sycamore Lane, casting gentle shadows across the hardwood floors that had witnessed decades of footsteps before Mariah's small sneakers joined their history. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral. 3 weeks since she'd packed her few belongings into 2 cardboard boxes and moved into her grandfather's spare bedroom. The room smelled of lavender sachets and old wood polish, a comforting blend that reminded her of Sunday visits when her mother was still alive. Grandfather Samuel, she'd always called him. Grandpa Sam moved through his morning routine with the deliberate patience of a man who understood that rushing through life meant missing its quiet treasures. He brewed coffee in an old percolator that gurgled and hissed on the gas stove, the sound as familiar as his gentle humming of hymns she half remembered from childhood. His hands, weathered from 30 years of carpentry work, handled the delicate china cups with surprising grace as he prepared her hot chocolate in the mornings, always with 3 small marshmallows floating like tiny clouds. The house itself seemed to breathe with memories. Built in 1952, it stood solid and unpretentious among the maple trees that lined the quiet street. The front porch sagged slightly on one side, held up by a jack that Grandpa Sam promised to fix when the weather cooperates, though Mariah suspected he enjoyed the excuse to sit in his porch swing a little longer each evening. Watching neighbors walk their dogs and children ride bicycles in the fading daylight, inside every surface told a story. The mantelpiece held framed photographs spanning decades. Her mother as a gap-toothed 7-year-old, graduation pictures, wedding photos, baby pictures of Mariah herself. But there were gaps too, spaces where frames once stood, leaving clean rectangles on the wood where dust had gathered around absent memories. When she asked about the empty spaces, Grandpa Sam would pause, his blue eyes growing distant before changing the subject with gentle firmness. The kitchen was the heart of their new routine. Each morning at 7:30, Mariah would pad downstairs in her slippers to find breakfast waiting. Scrambled eggs with cheese, toast cut into triangles, and a glass of orange juice poured into the same mason jar every day. Grandpa Sam believed in consistency, especially for children processing loss. Routine gives us something to hold on to when everything else feels uncertain, he'd say, settling into his chair with his coffee and the morning paper. Dusty had been her mother's final gift, adopted from the county shelter just 2 months before the accident. A medium-sized mutt with golden retriever enthusiasm and terrier determination, he possessed the uncanny ability to sense exactly when Mariah needed comfort. During the worst of her crying spells, he would rest his chin on her lap and stay perfectly still until her breathing steadied. At night he slept curled against her side, a warm guardian against the loneliness that crept in with the darkness. The backyard stretched nearly half an acre behind the house, bordered by a chain-link fence that separated their property from the Hendersons' next door. Ancient oak trees created a canopy of shade over most of the yard, their roots creating gentle hills and valleys in the grass that had grown wild during Grandpa Sam's bachelor years. A small garden plot near the back fence showed evidence of past cultivation, remnants of tomato cages, and the stubborn shoots of perennial herbs that returned. each spring despite neglect. It was in this backyard that Dusty first displayed his peculiar obsession. The spot was unremarkable, situated roughly 15 feet from the old oak tree, marked only by a slight depression in the earth where grass grew more sparsely. During their second week in the house, Mariah noticed Dusty sniffing the area with unusual intensity, circling the patch of ground with his nose pressed close to the soil. "What's he found there?" Grandpa Sam asked, joining her at the kitchen window where she watched Dusty's investigative work. "I don't know. He keeps going back to that same spot." Grandpa Sam's expression grew thoughtful as he observed the dog's behavior. "Dogs have a sense about things we humans miss. Maybe there's an old bone buried there, or the scent of some animal." But as days passed, Dusty's interest didn't wane. It intensified. He would spend entire afternoons lying beside the spot, occasionally pawing at the earth or whimpering softly, as if frustrated by some invisible barrier. When Mariah called him for dinner, he would reluctantly trot to the house, but look back over his shoulder toward his mysterious patch of ground. Their daily routine evolved around these observations. Breakfast was followed by Mariah's attempts at homeschooling. Grandpa Sam had convinced the school district to allow her a month of at-home instruction to help with the transition. He proved surprisingly adept at helping with mathematics, though he admitted his limitations with newer teaching methods. "We'll figure it out together," he'd say when they encountered a particularly confusing word problem. Learning is just another kind of patience. Afternoons were reserved for what Grandpa Sam called proper childhood activities. This might involve teaching her to use his old woodworking tools on simple projects, or walking to the corner store for penny candy, or sitting on the porch swing sharing stories about her mother's childhood in this same house. These conversations revealed the gentle philosophy that guided his approach to raising a grieving child. He never pushed her to get over her sadness, but instead created spaces where joy could gradually return alongside the sorrow. "Your mama used to love working in the garden," he told her one afternoon, as they weeded the abandoned flower beds together. "She had a way with roses that I never mastered. That plants needed conversation as much as water." His voice carried the particular cadence of fond remembrance, neither mournful nor artificially cheerful, but simply present with the truth of missing someone beloved. In the evenings, after dinner, dishes were cleared and homework reviewed. Grandpa Sam would retrieve an old leather photo album from the bookshelf in the living room. The album's covers were worn soft from handling, the binding cracked along the spine where it had been opened countless times over the years. Page by page, they would examine family history through fading photographs and Grandpa Sam's gentle narration. The album revealed a family more complex than Mariah had previously understood. There were photos of relatives she'd never met, faces that shared familiar features but belonged to names that meant nothing to her. When she asked about certain people in the pictures, Grandpa Sam would sometimes grow quiet, his finger tracing the edges of photographs, as if trying to remember not just the faces, but the feelings attached to them. "Who is this woman with Mama when she was little?" Mariah asked one evening, pointing to a photograph where her mother, perhaps 8 years old, stood beside a kind-faced woman with graying hair. Grandpa Sam studied the picture for a long moment. "That's your great-aunt Helen," he said quietly. "She was very special to your Mama. Where is she now? Can we visit her?" The question seemed to cause him physical discomfort. He closed the album more quickly than usual and set it aside. "Some family connections get complicated over time, sweetheart. Not everyone stays close like they should." These moments of unexplained distance puzzled Mariah, but she learned not to press when Grandpa Sam's demeanor shifted toward that particular sadness that seemed different from regular grief. It carried weight that went beyond missing her mother. It felt more like regret or perhaps guilt about things that couldn't be undone. The house itself seemed to hold secrets in its quiet corners. Sometimes Mariah would discover small mysteries: a woman's earring behind a radiator, a child's drawing tucked into a book, a recipe written in unfamiliar handwriting taped inside a kitchen cabinet. When she brought these findings to Grandpa Sam, he would examine them carefully before placing them in a small wooden box that he kept on his dresser. "Old houses collect memories like dust," he explained. "Not all of them belong to us, but they're part of the house's story." Dusty's backyard obsession continued to grow stronger. By the end of their third week, he had begun pawing more aggressively at the earth, leaving small scratches in the soil that Grandpa Sam would smooth over each morning. The dog's behavior became more urgent, almost frantic at times, as if he could sense something important just beyond his reach. "Maybe we should let him dig," Mariah suggested during breakfast one morning, watching Dusty circle his favorite spot with renewed determination. Grandpa Sam considered this while sipping his coffee. "I suppose it wouldn't hurt the yard any more than it's already been hurt. But dogs can make terrible messes when they really get going. I could help clean up afterward. We'll see," he replied, which Mariah had learned was his way of saying yes without committing to immediate action. Their conversations during these morning discussions revealed the patient wisdom that made Grandpa Sam such a comforting guardian during this difficult transition. He never dismissed her concerns or observations as childish, but instead treated her thoughts with the same respect he would offer an adult friend. This approach helped bridge the gap between her need for security and her growing desire to understand the complexities of the adult world that had suddenly become her reality. The neighborhood of Sycamore Lane provided its own gentle introduction to community life. Mrs. Henderson next door would wave from her kitchen window each morning and occasionally bring over fresh baked goods with messages of welcome and sympathy that acknowledged both Mariah's loss and her new beginning. Mr. Thompson across the street made a point of including Dusty in his evening dog walks, understanding that the animal needed social interaction beyond the confines of their backyard mystery. These small kindnesses wove themselves into the fabric of their new normal, creating the sense of belonging that Grandpa Sam knew was essential for healing. He had lost his own daughter, but he approached the responsibility of raising her child with determination tempered by gentleness, understanding that Mariah needed both security and space to process her grief in her own time and way. As their first month together neared its end, the rhythms of their shared life had settled into comfortable predictability. Morning routines, afternoon projects, evening stories from the photo album, and always Dusty's mysterious vigil in the backyard. The house on Sycamore Lane had become truly home, complete with its unexplained gaps in family history and the persistent sense that important stories remained untold. The old leather photo album would remain their evening ritual, but increasingly, Mariah found herself wondering about the missing pictures, the absent faces, and the relatives who existed only in Grandpa Sam's carefully measured memories. Some questions hung in the air, like the evening shadows that crept across their backyard, patient and persistent, waiting for the right moment to reveal their answers. The morning of Mariah's fourth week on Sycamore Lane began like any other, with the gentle sounds of Grandpa Sam preparing breakfast and Dusty's eager whimpering at the back door. But something felt different in the air, a tension that seemed to hum just below the surface of their comfortable routine. Dusty had barely touched his food, instead pacing between his bowl and the door with an urgency that made Mariah's stomach flutter with nervous anticipation. "He's been restless all night," Grandpa Sam observed, glancing out the kitchen window toward the backyard. "Kept getting up and scratching at the door around 3 in the morning." Mariah followed his gaze to where Dusty's mysterious patch of earth waited in the dappled morning sunlight. Over the past week, the dog's gentle pawing had become more insistent, leaving deeper scratches in the increasingly bare soil. Despite Grandpa Sam's attempts to discourage the behavior with gentle scolding and temporary barriers, Dusty's obsession had only grown stronger. "Maybe today we should just let him dig," Mariah suggested, though even as she spoke the words, something in her chest tightened with inexplicable apprehension. Grandpa Sam was quiet for a long moment, studying Dusty through the glass. "I've been thinking the same thing," he admitted. Sometimes fighting nature just makes things worse. And that dog has been trying to tell us something for weeks now. After breakfast, they stood together on the back porch, watching Dusty approach his chosen spot with the focused intensity of a soldier on a mission. Without his usual circling and sniffing, he went directly to the patch of disturbed earth and began digging with renewed purpose. His paws moved in steady rhythm, sending small sprays of soil flying as he worked deeper into the ground. "Should we help him?" Mariah asked, as Dusty's head disappeared below ground level, his tail wagging with the excitement of finally being allowed to pursue his mysterious quest. "Let's see what he finds first," Grandpa Sam replied, though his voice carried a note of concern that hadn't been there moments before. For nearly an hour, Dusty worked with single-minded determination. The hole grew steadily deeper and wider, requiring him to scramble out periodically to push the excess dirt away from his excavation site. His tongue lolled out with exertion, but his enthusiasm never flagged. If anything, he seemed to grow more excited as he progressed, occasionally pausing to thrust his nose deep into the hole and inhale deeply before resuming his work with renewed vigor. "Grandpa." "Look!" Mariah called out suddenly, pointing toward the hole where something dark had appeared beneath Dusty's paws. "I think he found something." They moved closer, watching as Dusty carefully pawed around the edges of what appeared to be a rectangular metal object buried about 2 feet below the surface. The dog whimpered with frustration, unable to extract whatever he had discovered from its earthen prison. "Easy, boy," Grandpa Sam said softly, kneeling beside the hole. "Let me give you a hand with that." Using a small gardening spade, he carefully loosened the soil around the object until its full shape became visible. It was indeed a metal box, roughly the size of a shoebox, with rust stains blooming across its corroded surface like abstract flowers. The weight of it surprised him as he lifted it from the hole, heavier than expected, suggesting substantial contents within. Dusty danced around them as they carried the box to the porch, his tail creating small dust clouds in his excitement. He seemed to understand that this discovery was the culmination of his weeks of patient labor, and his entire body vibrated with satisfaction at finally achieving his goal. "What do you think is inside?" Mariah asked, settling beside Grandpa Sam on the porch steps as he examined the box more closely. The metal was old but intact, with remnants of what might once have been green paint visible beneath the rust. A simple latch held it closed, though corrosion had made it stiff with age. Grandpa Sam worked it carefully until it clicked open, with a sound like a small sigh of relief. The interior revealed layers of folded papers, some wrapped in plastic bags that had protected them from moisture, others bearing the brown stains and soft edges of age despite the box's shelter. At first glance, they appeared to be letters, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one carefully folded and arranged with the precision of someone who understood their precious value. Mariah reached for the topmost letter, a yellowed envelope with careful cursive writing across its face. The ink had faded but remained legible. "My dearest daughter," it read, followed by a date that made her breath catch in her throat. "June 15th, 1963. "Grandpa," she whispered, holding the envelope so he could see the date. "This is from before Mama was even born." His face had gone very pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he took the envelope from her. He stared at the writing for a long moment, his lips moving silently, as if reading words that existed only in his memory. "Do you recognize the handwriting?" Mariah asked gently. Instead of answering, he carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the letter within. The paper was fragile but intact, covered in the same careful cursive that had addressed the envelope. As he read, tears began to gather in his eyes, though he made no sound of grief or surprise. "What does it say?" Mariah whispered. Grandpa Sam cleared his throat and began to read aloud, his voice steady despite his obvious emotion. "My dearest daughter, today marks 6 months since they took you from me, and I write this letter knowing I may never have the chance to send it. I think of you every morning when I wake up and every night before I sleep, wondering if you are safe and happy and loved the way I wanted to love you." He paused, his voice catching on the final words. Mariah moved closer, leaning against his shoulder as he continued reading. "I know they told me it was for the best, that a young woman with no husband and no money had no business raising a child. But they didn't understand that you were never a burden to me. You were hope itself, the most perfect thing I had ever created. I held you for exactly 17 minutes before they took you away. And those 17 minutes were the most important of my life." The letter continued for several more paragraphs, each one revealing the heartbreak of a mother separated from her child. It spoke of midnight walks around the house on Sycamore Lane, of a rocking chair that sat empty in what had been intended as a nursery, of letters written but never sent to a daughter whose name and location remained unknown. When Grandpa Sam finished reading, they sat in silence, both staring at the box full of similar letters. Dusty had settled at their feet, his head resting on Mariah's lap, as if he understood the gravity of his discovery. "Someone lived in our house," Mariah said finally. "Someone who had a baby taken away." Grandpa Sam nodded slowly, though his expression suggested this information wasn't entirely surprising to him. "Your great-aunt Helen," he said quietly. "She lived here before I bought the house from her back in 1985. The woman in the photo album? The one with Mama?" "The same one." He picked up another envelope from the box, this one dated 1967. "She never married, never had another child, but she never stopped writing letters to the daughter she lost." Mariah felt her heart breaking for this woman she had never known, imagining her sitting alone in what was now their living room, pouring her love into letters that could never be delivered. Why didn't she send them? Because she didn't know where to send them. Adoption records were sealed back then. Once a child was placed, the birth mother had no legal right to any information about what happened next. They spent the next hour carefully examining more letters, discovering a chronology of love and loss that spanned decades. Helen had written faithfully, sometimes daily, sometimes weekly, but always with the same tender devotion to a daughter who existed only in her imagination and hope. The letters revealed birthdays celebrated alone, Christmas mornings spent wondering if her child was happy, and the slow passage of years marked by unchanged love and undiminished longing. "But wait," Mariah said, pulling out an envelope from deeper in the box. "This one is dated last year." Grandpa Sam took the letter with hands that shook more noticeably now. The paper was crisp and white, the writing perhaps shakier, but unmistakably the same hand that had written the earlier letters. As he read, his face transformed, cycling through surprise, recognition, and something that looked almost like fear. "What is it?" Mariah asked. "She knows," he whispered. "She knows about you. About your mother." The implications of this discovery settled over them like an approaching storm. Somewhere out there lived a woman who had been writing love letters to a lost daughter for more than 50 years. And somehow she had learned that her daughter was gone, leaving behind a granddaughter she had never met. "Grandpa," Mariah said carefully, "is Helen my great-grandmother?" He looked at her with eyes full of tears and regret and nodded once. "Yes, sweetheart, she is. And I think it's time we had a very long conversation about family secrets." That evening, after a dinner neither of them could fully concentrate on, Mariah and Grandpa Sam spread the contents of the metal box across the living room coffee table. What had seemed like a random collection of letters in the afternoon light now revealed itself as a carefully organized archive of maternal love spanning more than 5 decades. "She dated everyone," Mariah observed, sorting through the envelopes. "Look, she wrote on birthdays, holidays, first days of school she imagined, graduation days she hoped for." Grandpa Sam handled each letter with reverence, as if touching something sacred. Helen always was organized. Even as a young woman, she kept careful records of everything important to her. They decided to read chronologically, starting with the earliest letters from 1963, each one painted a clearer picture of a young woman struggling with loss while maintaining hope. Helen wrote about her daily routines, her work at the local diner, her dreams for the daughter she had named Sarah in her heart, though she knew the child would carry another family's chosen name. "Listen to this," Mariah said, unfolding a letter dated December 1963. "I bought you a Christmas present today, my darling girl. A small wooden music box with a dancing ballerina. I know you are too young to appreciate it yet, but someday when we meet, I will give it to you along with all the other gifts I have been collecting. They fill the closet in your room, the room I keep ready for the day you come home to me." The image of Helen accumulating presents for a child she couldn't contact brought tears to Mariah's eyes. She made a whole life around someone she'd never see again. "Hope is powerful," Grandpa Sam said quietly. "Sometimes it's the only thing that keeps people going through impossible circumstances." As they progressed through the years, the letters revealed Helen's evolving understanding of her situation. In the early years, she wrote with the expectation of eventual reunion. By the 1970s, her tone had shifted toward acceptance, though her love remained unchanged. She began including more details about her own life, perhaps understanding that someday these letters might serve as the only biography her daughter would ever have of her birth mother. She moved to California in 1975, Mariah noted, reading a letter that mentioned Helen's decision to leave Sycamore Lane for new opportunities. "But she kept writing even after she left the house. She sold it to me 10 years later," Grandpa Sam explained, "when she decided to move back." This information puzzled Mariah. "But if she came back, why didn't you stay in contact?" Grandpa Sam's expression grew complex, shadowed by emotions he seemed reluctant to examine. "Adult relationships can be complicated, sweetheart. Sometimes people drift apart even when they care about each other." Deeper in the chronological progression, they discovered evidence that Helen's search for her daughter hadn't remained passive. Letters from the 1980s mentioned hiring private investigators, contacting adoption agencies, and trying to navigate legal channels that remained stubbornly closed. Her frustration bled through the careful handwriting, though her devotion never wavered. "I've been thinking more about what I don't know about my own history," the first entry began. "Mariah asked questions about grandparents and great-grandparents, and I realize how little I can tell her. Dad has always been vague about his family, and I've accepted that, but maybe I shouldn't have." Mariah felt a chill of recognition. Her mother had been questioning the same gaps in family history that she herself had noticed in Grandpa Sam's carefully edited stories and the missing photographs in his album. "Listen to this," she said, reading aloud from an entry dated 6 months later. "I went to the courthouse today to request copies of birth certificates for Dad's family. The clerk was helpful, but what I found raises more questions than answers. There are family members listed on these documents who I've never heard mentioned, including a sister of Dad's named Helen." Grandpa Sam had gone very still, his face pale in the attic's warm light. "Mama knew about Helen," Mariah said, looking up from the journal. "She was researching her." "Your mother was curious about things that were better left alone," he said quietly. Though his tone carried regret rather than anger, Mariah continued reading, discovering that her mother's investigation had grown more focused over time. She had contacted local historical societies, visited the library's genealogy section, and even hired a part-time researcher to help trace family connections that official records only hinted at. An entry from 18 months ago contained information that made Mariah's heart race. The researcher found property records showing that Helen Wilson owned our house from 1963 to 1985. She lived there alone for most of that time, and neighbors remember her as a quiet woman who kept to herself but was always kind to children. Mrs. Patterson at the corner store remembers her well and says she moved away suddenly, then came back about 10 years ago. Mrs. Patterson thinks she might still live in town. "Mama knew Helen lived here," Mariah said, her voice barely a whisper. "She knew Helen owned this house. Reading other people's private thoughts isn't always wise," Grandpa Sam said gently. But he made no move to take the journal away. The entries became more frequent and detailed as her mother's research progressed. She had traced Helen's employment history, discovered her involvement in local church activities, and learned about her reputation as someone who quietly helped young mothers in difficult situations. But the most significant discovery came in an entry dated just 8 months before her mother's death. "I think Helen Wilson might be my birth mother," the entry read. "The timeline matches. She would have been 22 when I was born. And the adoption records that I can access show a placement from this area during the right time period." Mrs. Patterson confirmed that Helen had a baby she gave up for adoption in 1963, and that she never stopped talking about finding her daughter someday. Mariah felt tears gathering in her eyes as she read her mother's growing certainty about Helen's identity and their relationship. The journal revealed months of careful investigation, emotional processing, and ultimate determination to make contact. She was going to reach out to Helen, Mariah said, reading an entry from just 6 months before the accident. She wrote down Helen's address and phone number. She was planning to call her. The final entries in the journal revealed her mother's internal struggle between the desire for connection and fear of disrupting Helen's life. She worried about being rejected, about opening old wounds, about the possibility that Helen had moved on and didn't want to be reminded of her past loss. The last entry, dated just 2 weeks before her death, was brief but decisive. "I've decided to call Helen tomorrow. Mariah deserves to know her great-grandmother, and Helen deserves to know that her daughter turned out well. Some risks are worth taking." "She never got the chance," Mariah said, closing the journal with shaking hands. Grandpa Sam had tears in his eyes as he reached for her. "Your mother was brave, sweetheart. She wanted to give you a bigger family, more people to love you. Did you know about any of this? About her research?" He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I suspected she was investigating family history. She asked me questions that she'd never asked before, and she seemed to know things about Helen that I hadn't told her. Why didn't you help her?" "Because I was afraid," he admitted. "Helen and I had a falling out many years ago about things that seemed important at the time but feel foolish now. I was too proud to admit I might have been wrong, and too stubborn to risk opening old wounds." They sat in silence among her mother's belongings, both processing the weight of missed opportunities and the complexity of family relationships that span decades of both love and regret. "Grandpa," Mariah said finally, "I think Mama would want us to finish what she started." He nodded slowly, understanding that their discovery of Helen's letters had been only the beginning of a much larger story that demanded completion. "Then we'll need to learn everything we can about Helen Wilson," he said. "And we'll need to find the courage that your mother had, to take the risks that love sometimes requires." The following afternoon found Mariah and Grandpa Sam at the Millville Public Library, a brick building that had served the community for over 60 years and housed the most comprehensive local records collection in the county. Mrs. Rodriguez, the head librarian, had known Mariah's mother and greeted them with the gentle sympathy of someone who understood they were there for more than casual research. "We're trying to piece together some family history," Grandpa Sam explained, his voice carrying the weight of someone finally ready to confront long-buried truths. "Specifically, we need to learn about a woman named Helen Wilson, who lived in town from the early 1960s through the mid-1980s. Mrs. Rodriguez nodded thoughtfully. "Helen Wilson was a dear friend of my late mother. A quiet woman, but she had a good heart. She helped many people over the years, especially young mothers who found themselves in difficult circumstances. She led them to the genealogy section, where microfiche machines hummed quietly beside computers loaded with digitized records. What kind of information are you looking for? Birth records, property deeds, anything that might help us understand her family connections, Mariah said, surprised by her own decisiveness. They spent the next hour navigating through decades of public records, building a clearer picture of Helen's life than the letters alone had provided. She had been born Helen Marie Wilson in 1941, the youngest of 3 children, in a family that owned a small farm outside town. Her parents had died in a car accident when she was 19, leaving her alone with limited resources and no close relatives. "Here's something," Grandpa Sam said, pointing to a property record on the computer screen. She bought the house on Sycamore Lane in 1963, just 3 months after giving birth. Mariah felt a chill of recognition. The timing aligned perfectly with the first letters they had found, with Helen's early writings about preparing a nursery for a daughter she couldn't keep. She had bought the house as a shrine to her lost child, a place where she could maintain hope for reunion. "Let me check birth records for 1963, Mrs. Rodriguez suggested, moving to a different database. If Helen had a child that year, there should be documentation. The search revealed a birth certificate that made Mariah's breath catch in her throat. Filed on March 15, 1963, was the birth record for a baby girl born to Helen Marie Wilson. The father was listed as unknown, and a notation in red ink indicated that the child had been surrendered for adoption through the county's social services department, but it was the handwritten notation at the bottom of the certificate that transformed their understanding of the entire situation. In careful script, someone had added, "Child placed with Samuel and Margaret Patterson, renamed Rebecca Marie Patterson." "Patterson," Mariah whispered. "That was Mama's maiden name before she married Daddy." Grandpa Sam had gone completely white, staring at the document as if it contained information that defied all logic. His hands trembled as he reached for the paper, though it was only a photocopy and couldn't be touched. "Grandpa," Mariah said carefully, "Mrs. Patterson was your wife. Mama's mother. Margaret couldn't have children," he said in a voice so quiet they had to lean forward to hear him. "We tried for years, went to doctors, prayed about it constantly. When the social worker called about a baby who needed placement, we thought it was an answer to our prayers. The revelation hung in the air between them, heavy, with implications that Mariah was only beginning to understand. Her mother had been Helen's lost daughter, the child whose letters filled that metal box. The baby Helen had held for exactly 17 minutes before saying goodbye forever. "You adopted Mama from Helen," Mariah said, working through the mathematics of heartbreak that had shaped her family's history. "Helen is my great-grandmother. We never knew the birth mother's name," Grandpa Sam continued, his voice breaking. "The records were sealed, and we were told it was better that way. We brought Rebecca home when she was 6 months old, and Margaret and I loved her as if she had been born to us." Mrs. Rodriguez had discreetly withdrawn to give them privacy for this family revelation, but Mariah could see her hovering nearby with tissues and the patient understanding of someone who had witnessed many such moments of genealogical discovery. "But Helen lived right here in town," Mariah said, struggling to comprehend the cruel irony of the situation. "Mama grew up just a few miles away from her birth mother, and they never knew about each other. Helen moved away in 1975, Grandpa Sam said. By then, Rebecca was 12 years old, just starting to ask questions about her adoption. Margaret and I had always planned to tell her the truth when she was old enough to handle it. But somehow, the right time never seemed to come. The weight of decades of missed opportunities pressed down on them like a physical force. Helen had spent 50 years writing letters to a daughter who lived in the same small town, while that daughter had grown up wondering about her origins and loving the man who had unknowingly separated her from her birth mother. When Helen came back to town in the 1980s, "Did you know it was her?" Mariah asked. Grandpa Sam's silence stretched long enough to serve as its own answer. Eventually he nodded. "I suspected. She looked familiar, and when I learned her name and that she had lived in what was now my house, I put the pieces together. But by then, Margaret had passed away and Rebecca was married with her own life. I convinced myself it was better to leave the past alone. But it wasn't better," Mariah said, thinking of her mother's journal entries and her desperate search for family connections. Mama needed to know about Helen. They both needed to know about each other. "I was protecting everyone," he said, though his voice carried no conviction. I was protecting Margaret's memory, Rebecca's sense of security, Helen's privacy. I was protecting myself from having to admit that I had kept a family apart. The afternoon sun was fading by the time they gathered their copies of the birth certificate and property records that documented the full scope of the separation that had defined 2 generations of their family. As they prepared to leave the library, Mrs. Rodriguez approached them with additional information. "I hope you don't mind," she said, "but I called my Aunt Dorothy Patterson, who was friends with Helen for many years. She'd like to meet with you both if you're interested in learning more about Helen's life here in town." The name rang familiar from Helen's address book, and Mariah felt a surge of hope at the prospect of connecting with someone who had known her great-grandmother personally. "We'd be grateful for any information she could share," Grandpa Sam said, though his exhaustion was evident in every word. As they walked home through the lengthening shadows of late afternoon, Mariah felt the strange sensation of seeing her neighborhood with new eyes. This was the place where her mother had grown up, unaware that her birth mother lived just a few streets away. This was where Helen had walked for decades, hoping for a glimpse of the daughter she had been forced to surrender. "Grandpa," she said, as they turned onto Sycamore Lane, "we have to find Helen. We have to tell her what happened to Mama, and we have to let her know that her granddaughter wants to meet her." He stopped walking and looked down at her with eyes full of tears and regret. "Are you sure you're ready for that, sweetheart? Finding her means opening up a world of complicated feelings and difficult conversations." "Mama was ready," Mariah said simply, "and I think Helen has been ready for 50 years. Dorothy Patterson's living room felt like a museum of mid-century kindness, filled with photographs, handmade Afghans, and the gentle accumulation of 8 decades of meaningful friendships. At 87, she moved with careful deliberation, but spoke with the clarity of someone whose memories remained sharp despite the passage of years. When she opened her door to Mariah and Grandpa Sam the next afternoon, her eyes immediately filled with recognition and sympathy. "Samuel Patterson," she said, embracing him with the familiarity of someone who had known him for decades. "I heard about Rebecca, and I've been praying for you both every day since the funeral." Her living room coffee table held a manila folder thick with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be medical papers dating back several decades. She had clearly prepared for this conversation with the thoroughness of someone who understood its importance. "Helen called me last night," Dorothy said, as they settled into her comfortable chairs. "She knows you've been asking questions about her, and she wanted me to share some things that might help you understand the whole situation." Mariah felt her heart race at the mention of Helen making contact. "She knows we're looking for her? Helen has kept track of this family for years, dear. She knew when Rebecca married, when you were born, and when your mother passed away." The grief nearly broke her heart all over again. Dorothy opened the manila folder and withdrew a set of hospital records from 1963, the papers yellowed with age, but still legible. "Helen wanted you to understand the circumstances surrounding Rebecca's birth, so you wouldn't judge her for the choices she felt forced to make." The medical records painted a picture of a young woman facing an impossible situation with limited resources and no family support. Helen had been unmarried and working as a waitress when she became pregnant. The father, according to Dorothy's gentle explanation, had been a traveling salesman who disappeared when he learned about the pregnancy. In 1963, unmarried mothers faced terrible social stigma, Dorothy explained. Helen tried to keep the baby, but she had no money for proper medical care, no family to help her, and the social pressure was overwhelming. The hospital records showed that Helen had initially refused to sign adoption papers, fighting to keep her daughter despite the recommendations of social workers and medical staff. It wasn't until she collapsed from exhaustion and malnutrition 6 months after the birth that the county intervened and placed the baby in emergency care. "She held on to hope for as long as she could," Dorothy continued. "But she was barely surviving herself, working 3 jobs and trying to care for an infant in a 1-room apartment with no heat. When they told her that a good family wanted to adopt the baby, she finally agreed because she thought it was what was best for her daughter. Grandpa Sam had remained silent throughout Dorothy's explanation, but Mariah could see the emotion building in his expression as he learned details about Helen's struggle that he had never known. The records show that she signed the papers on September 15th, 1963, Dorothy said, pointing to a legal document in the folder. But she made the social worker promise that if the adoptive family ever wanted to know about the birth mother, they would be given her information. We never asked, Grandpa Sam said quietly. Margaret and I were so focused on loving Rebecca and giving her a good life that we never thought about the woman who had made that possible. Dorothy withdrew another set of papers from the folder, these ones much more recent and bearing the letterhead of Millville General Hospital. These are from last month, she said gently. Helen has been having some health problems, and her doctor suggested she update her emergency contact information. The recent medical forms listed Helen's current address, a senior living facility just 20 minutes away, and included a section for family contacts. In careful handwriting, Helen had written, "Emergency contact, Samuel Patterson, adoptive father of my daughter Rebecca. Please inform him if anything happens to me, as I believe he deserves to know." She's been looking out for us, Mariah realized, understanding the profound generosity of someone who had remained concerned for the people who had raised her child, even through decades of separation. Helen never married, Dorothy continued. She dedicated her life to helping other young mothers in difficult situations. She worked as a counselor for unwed mothers, helped establish the county's first support services for single parents, and quietly provided financial assistance to families in crisis. She made losing Rebecca mean something by preventing other families from being torn apart the same way. The weight of Helen's sacrifice and subsequent service to others settled over Mariah like a profound understanding of love that extended far beyond personal relationships. Helen had transformed her loss into a lifetime of service, helping other families stay together while accepting her own permanent separation. But why didn't she try to contact us after Mama grew up? Mariah asked. The adoption records were sealed, but she knew our names and where we lived. Dorothy smiled sadly. She did try in her own way. Helen volunteered at every school event Rebecca attended, though she never approached her directly. She attended Rebecca's high school graduation, sitting in the back where she wouldn't be noticed. When Rebecca married, Helen made sure the church received an anonymous donation that covered all the flowers. She was there, Grandpa Sam said, his voice breaking with the realization of how many moments Helen had witnessed from a respectful distance. She watched Rebecca grow up without ever letting us know. Helen believed that Rebecca seemed happy and well-loved, and she didn't want to disrupt that, Dorothy explained. She felt she had forfeited her right to intrude on Rebecca's life when she signed those adoption papers. The medical records included recent notes from Helen's doctor about her current condition. She was physically frail but mentally sharp, living independently in a senior facility that provided some assistance with daily activities. Most significantly, the record showed that she had listed organ donation preferences and had requested that upon her death, any family members be notified of her passing. She's still hoping for contact, Mariah realized, reading the careful notations Helen had made about wanting her family to know if anything happened to her. Helen has spent 50 years respecting your privacy while never giving up hope that someday you might want to know her, Dorothy said. When she learned about Rebecca's accident, she wanted desperately to attend the funeral, but she was afraid her presence might cause additional pain during an already difficult time. Mariah felt anger rising in her chest, not at Helen, but at the circumstances and social expectations that had forced such unnecessary separations and continued isolation. "This is wrong," she said firmly. "Helen shouldn't have to die alone, wondering if her family cares about her." Grandpa Sam reached for Mariah's hand. "What are you thinking, sweetheart?" "I'm thinking that Mama would want us to finish what she started," Mariah said. And I'm thinking that Helen has waited long enough to meet her granddaughter. Dorothy smiled through her tears. Helen gave me permission to share her phone number if you decided you wanted to make contact. She's been hoping for this conversation for 50 years. The drive home from Dorothy Patterson's house passed in contemplative silence, both Mariah and Grandpa Sam processing the profound revelations about Helen's lifelong devotion to the family she had been forced to surrender. The manila folder of documents sat between them on the car seat, containing not just medical records and photographs, but Helen's phone number written on a small piece of paper that seemed to pulse with possibility. When they arrived at the house on Sycamore Lane, Dusty greeted them with his usual enthusiasm. But Mariah noticed he immediately went to the front window and resumed the vigilant watching behavior he had displayed the previous evening. His restlessness suggested an awareness of something beyond normal human perception, as if he could sense the approaching convergence of long-separated family members. "I need to check something," Grandpa Sam said as they entered the house, his voice carrying a tone of reluctant determination. He disappeared into his bedroom and returned moments later with a stack of phone bills, his hands trembling slightly as he spread them across the kitchen table. "What are you looking for?" Mariah asked, though something in his expression made her stomach flutter with apprehension. "Phone records," he said quietly, running his finger down columns of numbers on the most recent bill. "I've been getting calls from a number I didn't recognize, and after what Dorothy told us today, I have a feeling I know who's been trying to reach us." Mariah watched as he compared the phone bills from the past 3 months, circling repeated appearances of the same unfamiliar number. The calls had started just 2 weeks after her mother's funeral, appearing first as single attempts, then increasing to 2 or 3 calls per week by the most recent billing period. "This number," he said, pointing to an entry that appeared 6 times on the current month's statement. "It's been calling regularly, but I never answered because I didn't recognize it." The realization hit Mariah like a physical blow. "Grandpa, what if that's Helen's number? What if she's been trying to call us this whole time?" His face crumpled with the weight of a mistake that carried devastating implications. "I thought they were sales calls, or people wanting to talk about insurance after the funeral. I've been letting them go to the answering machine, but I never checked the messages." They rushed to the old answering machine that sat on the kitchen counter, its red light blinking with accumulated messages that had been ignored for weeks. Grandpa Sam's hands shook as he pressed the playback button, and the first message began with the tentative voice of an elderly woman speaking with careful formality. "Hello, Mr. Patterson. My name is Helen Wilson, and I believe you knew my daughter Rebecca. I was hoping we might be able to speak when you have a moment. My number is—" The message had been cut off by the machine's time limit, but it was followed by another message recorded 3 days later. "Mr. Patterson, this is Helen Wilson again. I understand this must be a difficult time for you, and I don't want to intrude on your grief. But I've been carrying some letters that belong to Rebecca, and I thought you and your granddaughter might want to have them. Please call me when you're ready." Mariah felt tears burning her eyes as Helen's voice continued through message after message, each one more heartbroken than the last. Helen spoke about attending the funeral from a distance, about wanting to offer comfort, but not knowing if her presence would be welcome, about having information that might help them understand their family history more completely. "She knows about the letters," Mariah whispered as one message mentioned Helen's awareness that important family documents might be buried in the backyard of the Sycamore Lane house. The final message, recorded just 3 days earlier, carried a tone of gentle resignation mixed with persistent hope. "Mr. Patterson, I want you to know that I'm not calling to cause disruption or pain. I simply wanted you and Mariah to know that Rebecca's birth mother has never stopped loving her, and that she has a grandmother who would very much like to meet her if that would be welcome. I'll stop calling now, but if you ever want to reach out, my number is 555-847. The silence that followed the last message seemed to echo with 50 years of missed connections and unnecessary separation. Grandpa Sam sat heavily in his kitchen chair, his face buried in his hands as the full scope of his avoidance became clear. "She's been trying to reach us for months," Mariah said, her voice rising with a mixture of hurt and anger she hadn't expected to feel toward her grandfather. "While I've been here grieving and feeling alone, my great-grandmother has been trying to contact us, and you've been ignoring her calls. I was protecting you," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "I was protecting both of us from having to deal with complicated family history during an already difficult time." "You weren't protecting me," Mariah shot back, her anger surprising both of them with its intensity. "You were protecting yourself from having to face the truth about what you did when you kept Helen away from Mama all those years." The accusation hung in the air between them, harsh but not inaccurate. Grandpa Sam had spent decades avoiding the consequences of his decision to keep Helen's identity secret, and now his protective instincts were causing additional pain for everyone involved. "Helen buried those letters in the backyard before she sold you the house," Mariah continued, working through the implications as she spoke. "She knew that someday someone would find them, and she hoped it would be her family. She's been waiting 30 years for us to discover those letters and reach out to her. I never meant for things to get this complicated," Grandpa Sam said, his voice breaking with regret. "But they are complicated," Mariah replied, though her anger was beginning to transform into something more productive. "And ignoring Helen isn't going to make them less complicated. It's just going to hurt everyone more." She picked up the phone with hands that trembled from nervousness and determination in equal measure. "I'm calling her. Right now." "Mariah, wait," Grandpa Sam said, reaching for the phone. "Maybe we should think about this more, plan what we're going to say." "Helen has been planning what to say for 50 years, Mariah replied, pulling the phone out of his reach. "And Mama never got the chance to say anything at all. I'm not going to let Helen die without knowing that her granddaughter wants to meet her." She dialed the number with careful precision, her heart pounding as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th ring, a gentle voice answered with cautious hope. "Hello, is this Helen Wilson?" Mariah asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Yes, this is Helen. Who am I speaking with?" "This is Mariah Patterson, Rebecca's daughter. I think you're my great-grandmother." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Mariah began to worry the call had been disconnected. Then she heard the sound of quiet crying, followed by Helen's voice shaking with emotion. "Oh, my dear girl, I've been hoping for this call for so very long." "I know," Mariah said, tears streaming down her face as she looked at Grandpa Sam, who was also crying as he listened to her half of the conversation. "We found your letters, Helen. We found all of them." "You found the box?" Helen asked, her voice filled with wonder and relief. "Dusty found it. My dog. He kept digging in the backyard until he uncovered it, and then we read every single letter you wrote to Mama." "And Samuel, is he there with you?" Mariah looked at her grandfather, who was nodding through his tears. "He's here. He wants to talk to you too. I've left so many messages," Helen said. "I was beginning to think you didn't want contact." "Grandpa didn't know the calls were from you," Mariah explained. "But we want contact now. We want to meet you." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, with Helen sharing stories about watching Rebecca from afar and Mariah describing her mother's research into family history. They talked about the funeral Helen had attended secretly, about the anniversary cards she had sent to their address every year on Rebecca's birthday, about the college scholarship Helen had anonymously established in Rebecca's name. When they finally hung up, both Mariah and Grandpa Sam sat in the kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of 50 years of separated love. The phone bills, the letters, the hospital records, and the profound understanding that family connections could survive even the most painful circumstances. "She wants to meet us," Mariah said. "Tomorrow, if we're ready." Grandpa Sam nodded, wiping his eyes with his handkerchief. "I think it's time, sweetheart. I think we're all ready to be a family again." The morning of their planned meeting with Helen dawned crisp and clear. the kind of autumn day that seemed designed for significant moments. Mariah had barely slept, her mind cycling through decades of questions that might finally receive answers, and her heart carrying the weight of representing her mother's memory in this long-awaited reunion. Helen had given them her address at Meadowbrook Senior Living, a well-maintained facility on the outskirts of town that provided independent living with access to assistance when needed. During their phone conversation the previous evening, she had described her small apartment with pride, mentioning the garden view and the photographs that covered every available surface, photographs that included images of Rebecca and Mariah taken secretly over the years. "I have pictures of you at your 5th birthday party," Helen had told Mariah, her voice filled with the bittersweet joy of a grandmother who had observed but never participated. "Mrs. Henderson, next door to your old house, was kind enough to share them with Dorothy, who passed them along to me. You were wearing a pink dress with white ribbons, and you looked so happy blowing out your candles." The revelation that Helen had been collecting photographic memories of their family's milestones added another layer to the complex emotions surrounding their reunion. She had been present in their lives as an invisible observer, accumulating a parallel family history built on second-hand information and distant love. Grandpa Sam moved through his morning routine with unusual care, selecting his best shirt and spending extra time combing his thinning hair. Mariah recognized the nervous energy that drove these preparations, the same careful attention to appearance that had marked important occasions throughout her childhood. Though none had carried the emotional weight of today's meeting. "Are you scared?" she asked, as they shared a breakfast neither could fully taste. "Terrified," he admitted with characteristic honesty. "Helen and I parted on difficult terms 30 years ago. I said things I shouldn't have said, and I've had 3 decades to regret my pride and stubbornness." "What kind of things?" Grandpa Sam was quiet for a long moment, stirring his coffee with mechanical precision while organizing his thoughts. "When Helen moved back to town in the 1980s, she tried to contact us, not to interfere with Rebecca's life, but to ask if she could have some small connection, maybe send birthday cards or contribute to Rebecca's college fund. I was angry about the disruption, afraid it would confuse Rebecca about her identity, and I told Helen to stay away from our family." The admission carried decades of accumulated guilt, and Mariah could see how the weight of that decision had affected him. "You were protecting Mama the way you thought was best. I was protecting myself," he corrected. "I was afraid that if Rebecca learned about Helen, she might decide she preferred her birth mother to the man who had raised her. It was selfish and stupid, but I couldn't risk losing my daughter to the woman who had given birth to her." The complexity of adoptive family relationships became clearer to Mariah as she considered the various fears and loyalties that had shaped their family's history. Everyone had been trying to protect someone else, but in doing so, they had created separations that served no one well. At 10:30, they drove through the familiar streets of Millville toward Meadowbrook Senior Living, passing landmarks that had gained new significance since learning about Helen's connection to their family. The corner store where Helen had worked, the church where she had volunteered, the library where she had researched adoption law changes. Each location now represented a piece of her ongoing devotion to the daughter she had been forced to surrender. Meadowbrook Senior Living occupied a beautifully landscaped campus that felt more like a small neighborhood than an institutional facility. Helen had given them specific directions to Building C, Apartment 2B, and had mentioned that she would be watching for their arrival from her living room window that faced the parking area. "There she is," Mariah said as they pulled into the parking space Helen had suggested. Through the large window of a second-floor apartment, they could see an elderly woman with silver hair watching their approach with obvious emotion. The walk from the parking lot to Helen's building felt both eternal and instantaneous, each step bringing them closer to a moment that would reshape their understanding of family and love. Mariah noticed that her grandfather's hands were shaking as they approached the entrance, and she reached for one of them, Surprised by how cold his fingers felt, despite the mild weather, Helen had left instructions with the building's receptionist to expect them, and they were directed to the elevator with warm smiles and expressions of excitement from staff members who clearly understood the significance of this visit. "Mrs. Wilson has been so excited about meeting you both," the receptionist said. "She's been preparing for days, and I've never seen her so happy." The elevator ride to the second floor lasted only moments, but Mariah felt her entire life shifting around her as they rose toward a meeting that would connect 3 generations of separated love. When the doors opened, Helen was waiting in the hallway, leaning slightly on a walker but standing as straight as her 84-year-old frame would allow. The first sight of her great-grandmother took Mariah's breath away. Helen possessed the same gentle eyes as her mother, the same careful way of holding her hands, the same slight tilt of her head when concentrating. The family resemblance was unmistakable, and Mariah understood immediately why her mother had felt drawn to investigate their family history. Some connections transcend conscious awareness and pull at the heart through inherited recognition. "Mariah," Helen said, her voice trembling with emotion as she extended her arms. "My dear, dear girl, you look so much like your mother when she was your age." The embrace that followed felt like the completion of a circuit that had been broken for decades. Helen's arms, though frail with age, held Mariah with the accumulated love of 50 years of longing, and Mariah found herself crying with an intensity that surprised her. This was the grandmother she had never known she was missing, the family connection that would have helped her understand her own identity more completely. Over Helen's shoulder, Mariah could see Grandpa Sam waiting his turn for reconciliation, his face a mixture of regret, hope, and the kind of vulnerable emotion that comes with confronting decades of avoidance. When Helen finally turned to him, the air seemed to hold its breath. "Hello, Samuel," she said simply, though her voice carried no accusation or anger, only the weariness of someone who had moved beyond blame toward acceptance. "Helen," he replied, his voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for everything I said, everything I kept from Rebecca, everything I stole from all of us. We all made choices that seemed right at the time," Helen said, embracing him with forgiveness that had been refined by years of reflection. "What matters now is that we're together." Helen's apartment was exactly as Mariah had imagined it would be. A careful curation of love expressed through photographs, letters, and mementos that documented a lifetime of caring from a distance. The walls displayed pictures of Rebecca at various ages, school photos that Dorothy Patterson had quietly provided, wedding pictures from sources Helen had never revealed, and recent photographs of Mariah that had been taken with zoom lenses from respectful distances. "I know it might seem strange," Helen said, noticing Mariah's wonder at the photographic documentation of their lives. "But these pictures were my way of staying connected to you both. Every birthday, every graduation, every important moment, I celebrated them all from here, in this room, grateful for whatever glimpses I could get of how you were growing and thriving." The coffee table held 3 photo albums that Helen had prepared specifically for this meeting, one containing pictures of herself as a young woman, documenting the life Rebecca had never known about, another filled with images of the gifts she had accumulated over the decades for the granddaughter she hoped to someday meet, and a third that showed Helen's work with other families, her efforts to prevent other children from experiencing the separation she had endured. "I brought you something," Helen said, disappearing briefly into her bedroom and returning with a small wooden music box. "This was the first present I bought for your mother when she was just a baby. I've been saving it for the day I could give it to someone in our family." The music box was exactly as described in Helen's early letters, a simple wooden box with a dancing ballerina that played a gentle lullaby when wound. As Mariah held it, she could imagine Helen as a young woman, purchasing this small treasure with hope and love, never knowing it would take 50 years to reach its intended recipient. "She would have loved it," Mariah said, thinking of her mother's appreciation for simple, meaningful gifts. "She does love it," Helen replied with quiet certainty. "Love doesn't end with death, dear girl. It just finds new ways to express itself." The afternoon passed in the gentle rhythm of family members reconnecting across decades of separation, sharing stories, examining photographs, and slowly weaving together the separate threads of their lives into a complete family narrative. Helen spoke about her work helping other young mothers. Grandpa Sam shared memories of raising Rebecca, and Mariah described her mother's research into family history and her determination to find the connections that had been hidden from her. As evening approached, they realized that this first meeting was not an ending, but a beginning, the start of rebuilding family relationships that should never have been broken. Helen presented them with a handwritten invitation to Thanksgiving dinner, her first opportunity in 50 years to cook for family members who knew she was family. "I have so many years to make up for," she said as they prepared to leave. "So many birthdays and holidays and ordinary days that we should have shared. I know we can't go back, but maybe we can move forward together." The drive home took place in contemplative silence, all of them processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. As they turned onto Sycamore Lane, Mariah noticed that Dusty was no longer maintaining his vigilant watch at the window. He was sleeping peacefully on his favorite cushion, as if he understood that his mission had been accomplished and his family was finally complete. The weeks following their reunion with Helen settled into a rhythm of healing that surprised everyone with its natural ease. What Mariah had expected to be awkward and complicated instead felt like the restoration of something that had always belonged in their lives. Helen called every Tuesday and Friday evening at exactly 7 o'clock, timing her calls to coincide with dinner cleanup when she knew they would be together and unhurried. These conversations became the foundation for rebuilding relationships that spanned 3 generations of love, loss, and rediscovered connection. Helen shared stories about her mother's childhood that Grandpa Sam had never heard, describing Rebecca's birth with details that only someone who had held her first could provide, and offering perspectives on family traits and tendencies that helped Mariah understand aspects of herself that had never made complete sense before. "Your mother had the most beautiful singing voice," Helen told Mariah during one of their Tuesday conversations. "Even as a baby, she would hum along with music on the radio. I used to sing lullabies to her during those 6 months we had together, and she would try to sing back in her baby way." This revelation explained something that had puzzled Mariah for years: her own instinctive musical ability that seemed to have no source in either Grandpa Sam's family or her father's more practically minded relatives. Helen's descriptions of Rebecca's early musical responsiveness provided the missing piece of genetic heritage that connected Mariah to talents she had inherited, but never fully understood. The second Tuesday of November brought an invitation that marked a significant milestone in their rebuilding family relationship. Helen had asked if they would be willing to have Thanksgiving dinner at her apartment, her first opportunity in 50 years to cook for family members who knew they were family. "I've been collecting recipes for decades," she told them, her voice bright with anticipation. "Traditional dishes I always imagined making for Rebecca and her family. I know my apartment is small, but I think we can make it work if you don't mind eating in the living room." The preparation for this Thanksgiving celebration became a community effort that revealed how many people had been quietly supporting Helen's long vigil of love from afar. Dorothy Patterson offered to provide additional seating. Mrs. Rodriguez from the library contributed her mother's recipe for cornbread stuffing, and several of Helen's neighbors at Meadowbrook volunteered to help with food preparation and serving. I never realized how many people knew about Helen's situation, Grandpa Sam observed as they planned their contributions to the dinner. "It seems like half the town has been keeping track of our family story for years." The day before Thanksgiving, Mariah and Grandpa Sam drove to Helen's apartment to help with preliminary preparations, carrying grocery bags filled with ingredients for dishes Helen had been planning since their reunion. They found her in her small kitchen, moving slowly but purposefully, as she began the elaborate process of cooking, her first family meal in more than 50 years. On the counter beside her cutting board lay a handwritten note that she had prepared for them, written on cream-colored stationery in her careful cursive script. The note was addressed to my dearest family and contained words that had been waiting decades for the right moment of expression. "I wrote this last night," Helen explained, noticing Mariah's attention to the letter. "I wanted to make sure I said everything I needed to say, in case I get too emotional tomorrow to speak clearly." The note began, "For 50 years, I have dreamed of this moment, the chance to welcome my family to my table, to serve them food prepared with love, to create the kind of memory that should have happened decades ago. I know we cannot recover the lost time, but we can fill the time we have left with all the love that has been waiting for expression." It continued with Helen's reflections on the journey that had brought them together, her gratitude for Dusty's persistent digging that had uncovered the buried letters, and her hope that their reunion might serve as healing, not just for their immediate family, but for the broader community of people who had been affected by their long separation. "I have spent most of my adult life helping other families stay together, but I could never put my own family back together until now," the note concluded. "Tomorrow, when we sit down to our meal, we will not just be sharing food. We will be sharing the love that has survived every separation, every misunderstanding, and every year of enforced silence. This is what grace looks like, the chance to love each other completely, without reservation, for whatever time we have remaining." As they worked together in Helen's small kitchen, preparing vegetables and organizing serving dishes, Mariah felt the profound satisfaction of participating in the kind of ordinary family activity that had been impossible for previous generations. Helen's physical frailty was obvious. Her hands shook slightly as she worked, and she needed frequent rests, but her emotional strength seemed to grow stronger with each shared task and conversation. "Your mother would have loved this," Helen said as they arranged flowers Dorothy Patterson had brought for the dinner table. "Rebecca always appreciated the small ceremonies that make ordinary moments feel special." "She would have loved knowing you," Mariah replied, understanding that her mother's research into family history had been driven by an instinctive awareness that important connections were missing from their lives. Grandpa Sam, who had remained mostly quiet during the afternoon's preparations, finally spoke up as they finished their work. "Helen, I need you to know how sorry I am about all the years we lost. I thought I was protecting Rebecca, but I was really just protecting myself from having to share her love." Helen turned from the stove, where she was checking the preparation of a sweet potato casserole that had been her mother's specialty. "Samuel, we all made decisions based on what we thought was best at the time. What matters now is that we're together, and that Mariah gets to grow up knowing she has a family that extends beyond what any of us initially understood." The embrace that followed seemed to heal not just the specific wounds between Helen and Grandpa Sam, but also the broader family ruptures that had affected multiple generations of their shared history. Thanksgiving Day arrived with the golden warmth of Indian summer, as if the weather itself was celebrating the reunion that was about to unfold in Helen's small apartment at Meadowbrook Senior Living. By 11 o'clock, the aromas of traditional holiday cooking filled the hallways of Building C, drawing appreciative comments from neighbors who understood the significance of Helen's first family dinner in more than 50 years. Mariah and Grandpa Sam arrived early to help with final preparations, carrying additional chairs borrowed from Dorothy Patterson and a bouquet of autumn flowers that Mariah had insisted on contributing to the celebration. They found Helen dressed in her finest outfit, a navy blue dress with pearl buttons that she had been saving for special occasions, moving through her kitchen with the focused energy of someone fulfilling a lifelong dream. "I've been awake since 4 this morning," Helen confessed, adjusting the placement of serving dishes for the 3rd time. "I kept thinking of things I wanted to add to the meal, recipes I've been saving for this exact day." The table had been set with Helen's good china, dishes that had remained in careful storage for decades while waiting for family to share them with. Each place setting included a small handwritten card with the guest's name, and beside Mariah's plate sat a small wrapped gift that Helen had been saving since learning of her granddaughter's existence. "Open it before we eat," Helen suggested, her eyes bright with the anticipation of someone who had waited years to give a gift chosen with love. Inside the carefully wrapped box, Mariah found a delicate silver locket on a thin chain, obviously old but beautifully maintained. When she opened it, one side contained a tiny photograph of her mother as a baby, one of the precious few pictures Helen had been allowed to keep from those 6 months they had shared together. "The other side is for you to fill," Helen explained. "I thought you might like to add a picture of yourself, so you could wear both generations of our family close to your heart." The locket represented everything Helen had hoped to give her family over the decades, not just material gifts, but connections to history, symbols of continuing love, and tangible reminders that family relationships transcend time and separation. As they sat down to their meal, Helen asked if she could say grace, something she had imagined doing at family gatherings for more than 50 years. Her prayer was simple and profound. "We thank you for the food before us, the family around us, and the love that has brought us together despite all the years and all the obstacles. Help us make the most of the time we have left together, and let this meal be the first of many happy gatherings in the years to come." The conversation that flowed throughout dinner revealed the depth of connection that had persisted despite decades of separation. Helen shared memories of Rebecca's early personality traits that perfectly explained aspects of Mariah's own character, while Grandpa Sam contributed stories about Rebecca's childhood that Helen had never heard but had often wondered about. "She was always trying to help people," Helen said, describing Rebecca's instinctive kindness toward anyone who seemed sad or lonely. "Even as a very small child, she would pat my face when I cried and try to make me feel better. That never changed," Grandpa Sam added. "Rebecca spent her entire adult life working with families in crisis, helping people navigate difficult situations. It's like she inherited your calling to help other people, even though she never knew about your work with unwed mothers." These connections between past and present helped Mariah understand that family traits and values could survive even the most complete separations, passing from one generation to the next through mechanisms that transcended conscious knowledge or direct contact. After dinner, Helen brought out a large photo album she had prepared specifically for this day, a careful compilation of pictures that documented her 50-year vigil of love for the family she had been forced to surrender. The album included not just the photographs of Rebecca and Mariah that she had collected from various sources, but also pictures of herself through the decades, creating a visual narrative that allowed them to know her as she had grown and changed during their years apart. "I wanted you to see that I never stopped being your family," Helen explained as they turned through pages that showed her at various ages, always alone, but always smiling in photographs that had been taken by friends who understood her need to document her life for the family she hoped to someday reconnect with. The afternoon's culminating moment came when Dorothy Patterson arrived with an old camera and suggested they take their first official family photograph, the 3 generations finally. Together in one frame, they arranged themselves on Helen's small sofa, with Helen in the center flanked by Grandpa Sam and Mariah, all of them wearing expressions of profound gratitude and contentment. As the camera clicked, capturing their first family portrait in 50 years, Mariah felt the completion of something that had been broken long before her birth. This photograph would serve as proof that love could survive any separation, that family connections could be restored even after decades of enforced silence, and that it was never too late to rebuild relationships that should never have been severed. "We'll take pictures every time we get together from now on," Helen declared as they examined the instant photograph that Dorothy's camera had produced. "We have 50 years of missing pictures to make up for." The commitment implicit in this statement, that they would continue to gather, continue to create memories, continue to function as family, represented the transformation of their reunion from a single meaningful event into an ongoing relationship that would shape the remainder of all their lives. As evening approached and they prepared to leave, Helen presented them with copies of all the photographs from her album, ensuring that they would take home not just memories of this day, but documentation of the love that had persisted through all the years of separation. "This isn't the end of our reunion," she said as they embraced goodbye. "This is the beginning of being family." Spring came early to Sycamore Lane, arriving with the kind of gentle warmth that made even the most persistent winter seem like a distant memory. 6 months had passed since that November day when Dusty had uncovered the metal box that changed their lives, and the rhythm of their days now included the steady presence of Helen Wilson, great-grandmother, letter writer, and the missing piece of their family puzzle that none of them had realized they were searching for. The house itself seemed to breathe more easily now, its rooms filled with the comfortable sounds of a family that had expanded beyond the original boundaries of grief and adjustment. Helen visited every Sunday afternoon, arriving punctually at 2 o'clock with small gifts for Mariah and updates about her neighbors at Meadowbrook Senior Living, who had become invested in following their family reunion story. These Sunday visits had developed their own gentle traditions. Helen would bring new photographs, some recent pictures of herself with friends, others discovered in boxes she continued to explore in her apartment, revealing additional glimpses into the 50 years of life they had missed together. They would work in the garden that Helen had helped them establish in the backyard, planting flowers in the exact spot where Dusty had discovered the buried letters. "It seems fitting," Helen had said when they decided to create the memorial garden. "This place held our family's pain for 30 years. Now it can hold our family's joy." The garden flourished under Helen's experienced care, creating a living symbol of growth and renewal that served as daily reminder of how family connections could survive even the most challenging circumstances. Dusty had claimed a favorite spot beside the flower bed, where he would rest in the afternoon sunshine, no longer restless or obsessed with mysterious scents, but simply content in the way that animals are when their humans have found peace. Mariah's own transformation during these months had been profound but gradual, like the changing seasons that marked the passage of time while slowly altering everything around them. The grief she carried for her mother had not disappeared, but it had evolved into something more manageable, a bittersweet appreciation for the time they had shared, combined with gratitude for the family connections that her mother's research had ultimately made possible. At school, where she had returned after completing her month of home instruction, Mariah found herself serving as a bridge between her own experience of loss and other students who were navigating family changes of their own. Her teacher, Mrs. Collins, noticed that Mariah had developed an unusual sensitivity to classmates who seemed lonely or displaced, often inviting them to join activities or simply listening when they needed someone to understand their struggles. "Loss teaches us about love," Helen had told Mariah during one of their garden conversations. "When we understand how precious family connections are, we become more careful about nurturing them and more generous about creating them with people who need belonging." Grandpa Sam's transformation had been equally significant, though manifested in different ways. The guilt and regret that had shadowed his interactions with family history had gradually been replaced by a kind of peaceful acceptance that allowed him to fully enjoy the present moment. His conversations with Helen revealed aspects of his own past that Mariah had never known. His fears about parenthood, his deep love for Margaret, his struggles with making decisions that would affect Rebecca's entire life. "I spent 30 years thinking I had made the wrong choice," he confided to Helen during one of their evening phone calls that Mariah occasionally overheard. "Now I realize there might not have been a completely right choice. There were just choices that led to different kinds of family happiness." The integration of Helen into their daily lives had happened with surprising naturalness, as if she had been temporarily absent rather than missing for 50 years. She attended Mariah's school programs, contributed to household discussions about major decisions, and provided the kind of generational wisdom that comes from having lived through multiple cycles of family joy and sorrow. On a warm April afternoon, as they worked together in the memorial garden that had replaced the site of Dusty's mysterious excavation, Helen presented Mariah with a letter written on familiar cream-colored stationery. Unlike the letters that had been buried for 30 years, this one was addressed directly to "My dearest granddaughter Mariah," and dated with the current day. "I thought it was time to start a new tradition," Helen explained, as Mariah opened the envelope with careful reverence. "For 50 years I wrote letters to family members I couldn't contact. Now I want to write letters to family members who are right here with me." The letter began, "My dearest Mariah, today marks exactly 6 months since you called me for the first time, and I wanted you to know how grateful I am for the courage you showed in reaching out to an old woman you had never met. You have given me the greatest gift of my entire life, the chance to be a grandmother to someone who needed a grandmother, and the opportunity to love someone who was ready to be loved." It continued with Helen's reflections on the changes that had occurred in all their lives since their reunion, her hopes for Mariah's future, and her promise to continue being present for all the ordinary and extraordinary moments that make up a family's shared history. "From now on," the letter concluded, "I will write you a letter every month, not because I cannot see you or speak with you, but because some feelings are too important to trust to memory alone. These letters will be my gift to you, and someday when I am gone, they will be my gift to your children and your children's children, proof that love can survive anything, and that family connections are the most precious treasures we can leave behind." As the sun set over Sycamore Lane that April evening, casting golden light across the memorial garden where letters had once been buried and flowers now bloomed, Mariah understood that their story was both ending and beginning. The mystery that had brought them together had been solved, but the relationships it had revealed would continue growing and deepening for whatever years remained to them. Dusty stretched contentedly beside the flower bed, no longer a dog with a mission, but simply a beloved family pet whose instincts had served a purpose larger than anyone could have imagined. The house on Sycamore Lane settled into evening quiet, its rooms filled with the peaceful satisfaction of a family made complete through the simple but profound act of refusing to let love be buried forever. In her bedroom that night, Mariah placed Helen's first monthly letter in the wooden music box that had waited 50 years to reach someone in their family, understanding that some gifts are worth any amount of patience, and that the most important discoveries often come from the persistent digging that love requires.